Marina sat in the corner of the bar in Jacksonville, North Carolina, watching the amber liquid swirl slowly in her glass. The establishment was a few blocks from Camp Lejeune military base, and like every Friday evening, it was packed with Marines in their khaki uniforms or casual clothes, celebrating the end of another week of intense training. She wore dark jeans and a simple gray cotton blouse, her blonde hair pulled back in a discreet ponytail. Nothing about her delicate appearance suggested what she truly was. At 28, Marina carried secrets known to very few people in the world. She was part of a top-secret American Special Forces unit, so classified it didn't even exist in official Pentagon records. Her specialty was infiltration into hostile environments, advanced hand-to-hand combat, and the elimination of high-value targets. For the past 6 years, she had operated in 13 different countries, from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, always in the shadows, always invisible. But that night, she was simply trying to relax after weeks of grueling training at a secret facility in the Virginia mountains. The bar was called The Anchor, an appropriate name considering its proximity to the military base. The walls were decorated with old photographs of warships, faded American flags, and rusty metal signs bearing patriotic slogans. The smell of spilled beer and fried food permeated the air, mingled with the sound of billiard balls clinking and lively conversations. Marina cherished these moments of normalcy, rare in her life. She could pretend, even if only for a few hours, that she was an ordinary person, leading an ordinary life. She noticed the group of Marines as soon as they entered. There were 6 men, all appearing to be in their early 20s, with characteristic military haircuts and that confident posture that came from rigorous training. They huddled near the bar, ordering rounds of beer and tequila, their voices growing progressively louder as the alcohol flowed. Marina observed them peripherally, a professional habit she could never completely switch off. She noticed the hierarchy among them, identified who the informal leader of the group was, and recognized the signs of genuine military camaraderie. One of them in particular caught her attention. He was taller than the others, with broad shoulders and muscular arms that strained the sleeves of his navy blue polo shirt. His face had angular features, a square jaw, and dark eyes that swept across the bar with an intensity Marina recognized immediately. It was the look of someone seeking confrontation, someone with something to prove. She mentally marked him as potential trouble, and deliberately averted her gaze, hoping that indifference would be enough to avoid any interaction. It wasn't. 20 minutes later, as Marina was finishing her second whiskey, she sensed a presence beside her. The smell of cheap beer and strong cologne arrived before the words. It was him, the tall Marine she had noticed earlier. He leaned against the bar next to her, deliberately invading her personal space, a smug smile on his face. His eyes scanned her from head to toe in a way that made Marina's skin tingle, not with attraction, but with professional alert. The Marine began with what he probably considered charm. He introduced himself as Derek, said he was a corporal and had been stationed in Lejeune for 2 years. His voice was slightly slurred, not too much, just enough to reveal that he had already consumed considerable amounts of alcohol. Marina responded politely but coldly, using short answers and avoiding prolonged eye contact. She hoped he would pick up on the obvious social cues of disinterest. Most people would have. Derek was not most people. As the minutes ticked by, Derek's behavior became progressively more aggressive. He moved closer, placed his hand on the bar so that his arm almost touched hers, and made increasingly inappropriate comments about her appearance. Marina maintained her composure, responding with monosyllables, her body language clearly closed off. She was acutely aware that any escalation on her part could result in consequences that would expose who she truly was. Her cover as an IT consultant depended on keeping an absolutely low profile, but Derek interpreted her restraint as weakness. He leaned closer, his warm breath against her face, and made an extremely vulgar comment about what he'd like to do to her. Marina felt the adrenaline begin to flow through her veins, that familiar sensation that precedes action. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had faced armed insurgents in Afghanistan, arms dealers in Somalia, hostile intelligence agents in Russia. She wouldn't be provoked by a drunken Marine in a North Carolina bar. Marina turned to face him directly, her voice low but firm. She stated clearly that she wasn't interested and asked him to leave her alone. For a brief moment, she saw something pass through Derek's eyes, perhaps a flicker of reason or recognition that he had crossed a line. But then his friends on the other side of the bar began to laugh and make comments, and Marina saw wounded male pride transform into real-time rage. Derek couldn't back down now, not in front of his colleagues, not when his masculinity was being challenged by a woman who weighed 60 pounds wet. What happened next happened very quickly. Derek reached out and grabbed Marina's arm, his fingers squeezing hard enough to hurt. He pulled her off the stool, his face contorted with anger, and began dragging her toward the back door of the bar. The other people around started to notice, some heads turning, but no one intervened immediately. It was that common moment of confusion where bystanders aren't sure if they should get involved, if it's a couple's argument, if it's any of their business. Marina didn't hesitate. 6 years of special forces, training, including Israeli Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and hand-to-hand combat techniques developed by the CIA, took over. Her brain automatically went into operational mode, calculating angles, pressure points, neutralization options. She had 3 simultaneous objectives: to free herself, to neutralize the threat, and crucially, to do so in a way that appeared to be luck or basic survival instinct, not advanced military training. She twisted his arm in a specific way, using biomechanics, against Derek's grip, and simultaneously stomped hard on the instep of his foot with the heel of her boot. Derek cried out in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for only a fraction of a second. That was all Marina needed. She broke free completely, spun to create distance, and assumed a defensive stance that looked casual to untrained observers, but any combat expert would recognize as a professional-level fighting position. Derek's friends reacted immediately. 2 of them began to advance, toward Marina, their expressions showing a mixture of loyalty to their comrade and indignation that a woman had dared to defend herself. The noise in the establishment decreased drastically. Dozens of eyes now focused on the unfolding confrontation. The bartender, an older man with a pronounced belly and arms covered in faded tattoos, began shouting that he would call the police. Marina quickly calculated her options. She was clearly outnumbered, surrounded by militarily trained men in a hostile environment. Derek regained his balance and lunged at her again, this time with clenched fists. Marina could see in his eyes that he was beyond reason now, operating purely on rage and alcohol. He threw a savage punch toward her face, all his body weight behind the blow. For anyone untrained, it would have been devastating. For Marina, it was almost comically slow. She saw the punch coming as if in slow motion, noticed the tactical errors, the bad angles, the lack of protection from her guard. She dodged the blow with minimal movement, merely turning her head a few inches to the side, and simultaneously counterattacked. Her elbow connected with Derek's ribs with surgical precision, striking exactly where she knew it would cause maximum pain, without inflicting permanent damage. The air left his lungs in a grunt, and he doubled over slightly. Marina followed with a sweep that seemed accidental, but was perfectly executed, sweeping Derek's legs from beneath him. He fell heavily onto the bar's wooden floor, the impact reverberating through the establishment. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in the bar was now staring, frozen in shock. A small woman had just taken down a trained Marine as if it were nothing. Derek's friends stood there, clearly confused about how to process what they had just witnessed. Marina maintained her composure, breathing steadily, every muscle poised to continue if necessary, but hoping that the display of skill would be enough to end the confrontation. Derek groaned on the ground, trying to catch his breath. Marina could see the confusion in his eyes, the utter incomprehension of how he had ended up on the ground. To him, it must have seemed impossible. He was a Marine, trained for combat, physically superior. How had a seemingly ordinary civilian done this? Marina maintained her neutral expression, but internally she was calculating the damage. How many people had seen it? Had anyone filmed it? Would it reach the wrong ears? One of Derek's friends, a man with very short red hair and freckles covering his face, stepped forward. His hands were raised in a conciliatory gesture, but Marina could see in his eyes that he was assessing the situation, trying to decide his next move. He looked at Derek on the ground, then at Marina, then at his other companions. The social mathematics were happening in real time. They could attack her as a group, but now there were witnesses, and she was clearly not an easy victim. The red-haired man finally spoke, his voice surprisingly calm given the circumstances. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that Derek had drunk too much, that they would take him away. Marina detected genuine sincerity in his tone. but also an attempt to save face, to de-escalate before the situation became official. She nodded briefly, saying nothing, maintaining her guard as she watched two of the Marines help Derek to his feet. He was still dizzy, a hand pressing against his ribs where Marina's elbow had touched. As the group began to move toward the exit, Derek glanced back at Marina. There was something different in his eyes now, no longer anger or lust, but something closer to fear and confusion. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but his red-haired friend pushed him firmly toward the door. Marina watched them leave, her posture relaxing only slightly, her whole being still on high alert in case they decided to return with reinforcements. The bartender approached her cautiously, as if he were approaching a wild animal. He was clearly a veteran. Marina could see it in the faded patches on his jacket hanging behind the bar. His eyes studied her with an intensity different from the other patrons, the recognition of someone who had seen real combat. He asked if she was all right, offered to call the police, said that Derek and his friends were banned from the establishment. Marina thanked him politely but declined, saying only that she wanted to finish her drink and leave. The bar gradually returned to its normal cacophony, though Marina could still feel curious glances directed at her. Whispered conversations, theories being formed. Some assumed she had self-defense training, others that it had been luck, still others that Derek was more drunk than he seemed. No one guessed the truth. They had just witnessed a special forces operator in action, one of the deadliest warriors the country produced. Marina finished her drink quickly, left more than enough cash at the bar, and walked out the front door. The North Carolina night air was humid and warm, carrying the scent of pine and salt from the nearby ocean. She walked briskly to her car, an unassuming sedan that didn't attract attention, constantly checking around to make sure she wasn't being followed. Her mind was already racing with her next steps. Did she need to report the incident? Had she compromised her cover? Would someone draw dangerous conclusions? As she drove back to her temporary apartment, Marina reflected on the irony of the situation. She had survived missions in war zones, faced terrorists and enemy agents, jumped from planes and dived into stormy seas. And yet, a drunken Marine in a North Carolina bar had almost exposed her secret identity. It was a reminder that danger came from unexpected directions, that constant vigilance was necessary not only on distant battlefields, but also at home. In the following days, Marina carefully monitored any repercussions of the incident. She checked social media, contacted her handlers at the agency, and confirmed that no video had circulated. Derek, it turned out, had been reprimanded by his superiors and given extra disciplinary tasks. He told his colleagues that he had been attacked by a professional MMA fighter, a story that was easier for his ego to swallow than the truth that he had been easily neutralized by a woman who appeared to be just another civilian. Marina never returned to that bar, but the experience stayed with her, a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, even when striving to be invisible, sometimes the world forces you to show who you really are. And in that moment at the anchor, for a few brief seconds, everyone had seen not the discreet IT consultant, but the lethal warrior hiding beneath the surface. It was a secret she would have to carry, like so many others, in the silent depths of her extraordinary life. 3 weeks after the bar incident, Marina sat in a windowless briefing room in the basement of an unmarked government building in Arlington, Virginia. The room was sterile, with pale gray walls, a cold metal desk, and uncomfortable chairs designed to discourage prolonged meetings. Her commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Mendez, a 50-year-old woman with gray hair cut in a practical bob and piercing eyes that never missed a detail, was reviewing the Jacksonville incident report. Mendez didn't seem exactly angry, but her expression carried that professional disappointment that was somehow worse than open rage. She placed the papers on the table and looked directly at Marina, her fingers interlaced in a posture that suggested forced patience. The room was completely silent, except for the almost imperceptible hum of the ventilation system and the distant ticking of a clock on the wall that Marina couldn't see, but could hear perfectly. Mendez began to speak, her voice measured and controlled. She acknowledged that Marina had been placed in an impossible position, that no operator should have to tolerate physical aggression, that the instinct for self-defense was natural and justified. However, she continued, there were unforeseen consequences. The incident had generated curiosity, questions, unwanted attention. 3 different people in the bar that night had military connections and had begun to speculate about Marina's background. Rumors were circulating. Marina listened in silence, her face maintaining the neutral expression. She had perfected over years of undercover operations. Internally, she felt the familiar weight of frustration that came from living a double life. She had done everything right, had tried to avoid confrontation, had used the minimum force necessary when forced to act. And yet, here she was, being reprimanded because her competence was too obvious, because defending herself was inconvenient for her cover. Mendez went on to explain that the unit had decided to expedite Marina's next mission. Originally planned for 2 months in the future, it would now be implemented in 10 days. They needed to get her out of the Jacksonville area before more questions arose, before anyone started digging too deep into her fabricated history. The mission involved infiltrating an arms trafficking network operating between Ukraine and Middle Eastern countries. It would be dangerous, lengthy, and completely isolated from direct support. In the days that followed, Marina immersed herself in mission preparation. She spent hours in underground training rooms, perfecting her Ukrainian and Arabic, studying target dossiers, memorizing escape routes, and emergency communication protocols. The work was exhausting and consuming, but it also offered a kind of relief. In the field, on a mission, she could be completely herself. There was no need to feign weakness, to modulate her competence, to make herself small so that others would feel comfortable. One afternoon, during a break in training, Marina found herself thinking about Derek. She wondered what had happened to him after that night, whether he had learned anything from the experience or simply dismissed it as an embarrassing anomaly. She wondered if he had any idea how lucky he had been, that if she wanted to, she could have seriously hurt him or worse. But mostly, she wondered about the fundamental injustice of it all, that he had acted aggressively and inappropriately, but she was the one facing the professional consequences. Marina also thought about the other women in the bar that night, those who didn't have her training, her ability to defend herself. How many of them had experienced similar behavior from men like Derek? How many had been forced to tolerate it because they had no choice, because reacting seemed riskier than submitting? The power disparity was glaring, and for the first time in years, Marina felt genuine anger about it. Not hot, impulsive anger, but something colder and more enduring. On her last day before leaving for the mission, Marina performed a ritual she had developed over the years. She visited places in Washington, D.C., that connected her to her civilian life, to the person she pretended to be. She had coffee at a cafe where she was a regular, chatted briefly with the barista who always remembered her order, walked along the National Mall while tourists took photos and families had picnics. She absorbed the normalcy, storing it up for the difficult days to come. That night, alone, in her apartment, Marina packed methodically. Each item was carefully considered, checked, rechecked, fake documents, encrypted communication devices, money in various currencies, medications, toiletries, clothes that would fit into different contexts. She worked in silence, her movements efficient and practiced. There was a strange meditation in this process, a way of preparing not only her equipment, but also her mind for the transformation to come. Before going to sleep, Marina allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. She took a small photo from her drawer, the only real connection to her previous life. It was from her graduation from the military academy, 4 years before she was recruited into the Special Forces. Her parents were beside her, proud smiles on their faces. They had died in a car accident 2 years later, never knowing what their daughter really did, never knowing about the missions, the dangers, the secrets. It was better that way, Marina always thought. Fewer people to worry about, fewer vulnerabilities to exploit. The following morning, Marina disappeared. The discreet IT consultant transformed into a Russian arms dealer, then a Ukrainian journalist, then a Syrian academic. She crossed borders, assumed identities, operated on the fringes of international legality. The mission lasted 4 months, and when it finally ended, when she emerged on the other side whole, but changed as always happened, the incident at the bar in Jacksonville seemed to belong to another life entirely. But the lessons remained. Marina learned that no matter how carefully she constructed her cover, how meticulously she concealed her abilities, moments would come when she would be forced to choose between safety and dignity. And she had chosen dignity. That choice defined her as much as any mission, as much as any secret medal kept in vaults she would never see. She was a warrior, yes, but also a woman refusing to be a victim, even when that refusal cost her something. Years later, when Marina would eventually retire from field operations and take on a training role, she would tell this story to new female recruits. She would explain the impossible complexity of being simultaneously lethal and invisible, competent and underestimated, strong and feminine. She would teach them not only combat techniques, but also the art of navigating a world that often didn't know how to deal with women who refused to be defenseless. And she always ended the story the same way. Derek had attacked a girl in a bar, unaware that she was a secret special forces fighter. But the real lesson wasn't about his ignorance or his defeat. It was about the resilience needed to live a life of contradictions, to be extraordinary while pretending to be ordinary, to protect those who would never know they needed protection. That, Marina would tell the young recruits, was true strength, what they were looking for. Not just muscles or techniques, but the courage to fully exist in a world that constantly demanded they make themselves smaller,